Hello and welcome to the interview. Since the Brexit referendum, voters in several other European countries have expressed their anxiety at the ballot box about immigration, cultural values and security. Now Sweden, once called the world's moral superpower, is showing strains, with the far right making solid gains in the most recent parliamentary election there. The far right in Europe is not winning elections outright, but some say it is winning slowly, incrementally, and the Sweden Democrats are a good example of that. They've progressed from a 5% share of the national vote in 2010 to nearly 18% this year. Well, to draw some parallels and differences between far-right phenomena in Europe and the US, I'm joined by Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She's a senior fellow at the UK-based Centre for the Analysis of the Radical Right. She's also professor at the American University in Washington and author of The Extreme Gone Mainstream, published this year by Princeton University Press. She joins me from the US Capitol today. Thank you so much for being our guest on the interview, Professor Miller-Idriss. I want to start by asking you about Sweden. Liberals keep saying the good news is 82% of Swedish voters did not support the far right. But do you think those liberals have just got their heads in the sand?
Well, thank you for having me. And the Swedish question, I think, is an important one to consider because Sweden has long been kind of such a strong bastion of liberal and centrist support. And 18% is an important, 18% are high numbers. I think those numbers weren't as high as some people had feared they could go. And so the story here is an important one about moderation, about there still being a strong majority of Swedish citizens who reject the far right and reject the far right's anti-immigrant sentiments. But moving from 5% to almost 18% in 8 years is not insignificant, and so it should be monitored, and we have to continue to watch it.
Do you see any response, though, by the establishment in Europe? Because it seems when you look at far-right gains across this continent, there isn't really any clear message to voters as to why they shouldn't vote for the far right, and perhaps that's why it is gaining very slowly but steadily.
Yes, I think one of the things we're seeing happen across Europe and even in the U.S. is that center and more moderate parties, in an effort to retain voters from the mainstream, have sometimes started to adopt some of those same anti-immigrant and anti-Islam rhetorics and sentiments, and then it gets harder to distinguish between what the center wants and what the far right wants. And in that case, the far right comes across as more sincere, more authentic, and stronger. So I think that's a mistake. I think the center parties and moderate parties have to continue to be very clear about what they stand for on moral grounds, on ethical grounds, on democratic grounds, to make it clearer to voters how they are different from what the far right promises.
You've just come back from Germany. Now, I suppose you might say that the mainstream in Germany has failed to do that exact thing that you've just said, as in to clearly say that the centre stands for something different. Certainly, if you look at the recent reactions by the CSU head, it's not going in that direction of clearly demarcating mainstream parties from the far right.
Absolutely. I think Germany is a perfect example of what actually we're seeing across Europe and to some extent in the US, is that three previously separate areas of growth for the far right, that is the kind of militant neo-Nazi scene, the far right parties, and then these sort of ordinary citizens who have been increasingly kind of going to the streets in Pegida marches, these patriotic Europeans against the Islamification of the West. Those three groups came together in a coalition in Chemnitz for the first time in a quarter century. We really hadn't seen that kind of cooperation on the streets, and that's why you ended up with 6,000 people. And I think that the center, instead of being very strong in its opposition to that emerging coalition and strength across these disparate groups, is making some of the same mistakes by kind of legitimizing some of the concerns, and that just isn't a good way to retain mainstream voters.
Well, if apparently moderate people marched with the far right in Chemnitz, what does that say about the far right? I mean, clearly their ideas have not gone mainstream, but is there something about their marketing that has gone mainstream and attracted more centrist people?
Yes, I think the far right has done, I mean, I think the extreme far right has made itself appear more mainstream in many ways. I think that having far right groups who present themselves aesthetically in their style as more mainstream, they're less, less extreme looking even than they used to look, and then trying to and kind of making their way and inroads into political parties where you have people with suits who have educations who come across in a much more legitimate way. That makes a mainstream voter, less suspicious of the motives behind some of the rhetoric.
I mean, that brings me to a point. You were telling me before this interview about the appearance of far-right marchers in Charlottesville in the US, in that sort of notorious incident, wearing polo shirts and things like that. But of course, nice clothes, that doesn't equate itself with far right. A Lacoste symbol doesn't equal far right. So just sort of untangle this a bit more for us, because on the one hand, you've got actual far right symbols that are produced by certain clothing companies that cater to that sort of marginal group of people in society. But so there's something separate from sort of mainstream brands.
Yes, I mean, I think what we saw in Charlottesville last year, those khaki those khaki pants and clean-cut polo shirts, was a deliberate, intentional, strategic move on the part of the far right to appear more mainstream. It came about because of a call that came from a far right leader in the U.S. To show up looking mainstream, and he actually said on his blog, the way we look is more important than our ideas in terms of people kind of accepting them. So they figured that out.
Do you think, I mean, maybe it's too early to have a sort of research answer to this, but what is the effect of that, of looking mainstream? And obviously it makes, as it were, moderate people less afraid. But does it have any impact on actual voting behavior?
I think that when the ideas come across in a package that doesn't fit with the picture that mainstream voters have in their heads of, what a white supremacist looks like, I think those ideas themselves then seem more palatable, seem more acceptable to voters. And so I think those things are very much intertwined. People have this idea in their heads that, in the U.S. anyway, a white supremacist is, has a Ku Klux Klan hood or is coming out of an Aryan Brotherhood prison gang or something. But when those same ideas about the remigration of non-ethnic minorities or white separatist ideas are presented in a much more subtle way through someone wearing a business suit or clean-cut clothes, I think it's harder. That's a jarring kind of psychological jump for people to make, and they don't reject them as easily.
Yeah, and it's not only the clothing, of course, it's the actual political discourse, the words that have been softened, and we see this today in the drive by Steve Bannon, the former advisor to Donald Trump, who's now trying to build something called the movement here in Europe. He's meeting various far-right leaders across the continent, and he's saying again, oh no, we don't want to destroy the European Union, we just want it to be more, catering to the needs of nation states. So that kind of softening is happening here as well. What do you think of Steve Bannon's attempt to sort of bring together the far right here in the EU?
Well, in general, I think that far-right groups and leaders in the U.S. are far more interested in Europe than we have seen in reverse. I mean, you'll see far-right groups in the States having things on their website saying, we're supporting the struggle abroad, and their counterparts in Europe will say, we don't do anything with groups outside of the European Union, outside of Europe. So this idea that the U.S. feels this sense of European heritage among its white supremacist groups is not met by interest, I think, on the European side. And I think that's what we're seeing with Bannon being overwhelmingly rejected by far-right groups in Europe. They're, on the one hand, not very interested in an American influence or an American. On the other hand, I think Bannon himself is widely seen as quite extreme in the U.S. And by saying things like he did in March in France last year, wear your racism like a badge of honor, that is not the the kind of mainstream appeal that far-right groups are trying to go for. So I don't see it, despite some, some indication that there may be some Italian support for his movement. I just can't see it really having much influence.
Yeah, so the far-right is in quite a different place in the US from what it is in Europe. We'll have to end it there, but thank you so much for your insights and for being our guest, Cynthia Miller-Idriss from the American University of Washington. And that's all for this edition of The Interview. Thank you so much for watching.